see it.
Welcome to the show. This is The Magician and the Fool podcast, episode number 58. My name is Dominic. I am one of the co-hosts of the show. The other co-host is named Janus, and he will be on here in a few minutes. Today we are delighted to have Shea Bile on the show. He is an author, occult lecturer, musician, performance artist, and podcast host. A devoted occultist for over 20 years, his committed adherence to subversive forms of spiritual expression has served as a vital foundation for his work. He has conducted lectures and workshops throughout the United States and beyond, primarily on subjects related to left-hand path occultism and religious heterodoxy. He is the host of the Deferred Gnosis podcast, a show primarily focused on investigating and exploring contemporary and fringe philosophical, spiritual, and religious subjects. As a ritual performance artist, he blends various forms of esoteric practice with transgressive ritual expression. His occult writings have appeared in numerous print and digital publications, his most recent being Friedrich Nietzsche and the Left-Hand Path, an occult philosophical treatise published by Atramentus Press. Recent profile pieces, of which Shea Bile has been the subject, have appeared in Vice, 60-Second Docs, and the forthcoming documentary series The Secret Teachings of All Ages. He is the founder of the Occult Student Alliance based in San Francisco at San Francisco State University, and the Black Sun Sect based at KU Leuven in Leuven, Belgium. Both are esoteric organizations created to provide an empowering and sympathetic community for those who feel called to a path outside of traditional spirituality. He holds a master's degree in philosophy from the Katholieke University Leuven in Leuven, Belgium. You can find info on this new book, Friedrich Nietzsche and the Left-Hand Path, from the publisher Atramentus Press at ATRAMENTOUS press.com. For someone like myself who grew up in a very ethnically Catholic family and community, and who lived through the satanic panic of the 80s and into the 90s, and even had his Dungeons and Dragons manuals confiscated, it's obvious the stereotypes that were burned into the fabric of society at that time by the evangelical Christians in America, and continue to the present day. It's interesting to talk to someone who identifies as a Satanist, and those people who are participating in what is the left-hand path, because there are so many deeply ingrained ideological characterizations of Satan and Satanists, and a lot of people who identify as such tend to sometimes lean into those stereotypes. But as you will see in this interview, I think there's much more to it. As always, I want to say thank you to our very generous and supportive Patreon members. It's very encouraging to know that you all are out there listening and supporting, and it makes this so much more worthwhile. We dedicate this to Hermes and Asclepius, and may any merits that we accumulate doing this work be distributed to all sentient beings, so that they together with us may equally realize awakening. Okay, we are extremely excited to have Shea Bile here on the show to discuss his new book, Friedrich Nietzsche and the Left-Hand Path, as well as all sorts of other things pertaining to the left-hand path. Welcome to the show, Shea.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you guys so much. I am honored to be on, and I highly respect the work that you and Janice do. So thank you for having me.
Oh, you're very welcome. Looking forward to it. We like to provide a little bit of a fresh perspective, so I think this will be nice with that.
Shea, let's just start with, if you wouldn't mind, just get into maybe a little bit about yourself and how you got where you are right now, and then we'll kind of branch out.
Sure. I grew up in a pretty dicey area of Los Angeles. My mother was a bit of a self-proclaimed medium, and we grew up in, I guess, what some might call a haunted house. And not only was I relegated with stories of past lives, but also explanations to some of the phenomena that was happening in our home. And beyond that, it was, like I said, it was a pretty seedy part of Los Angeles, and in the early and mid 90s, it was a pretty violent and calamitous time there on the West Coast. And given those parameters, I sought to find myself to escape, a form of escapism and spiritual escapism, and that found me an interest in different things, science fiction, fantasy, but also the occult and philosophy. And from there, I quickly found Satanism, and it's been with me over the years, and I've delved into it deeper and deeper to the point that I've begun to write about it and lecture about it in different parts of the world. And it's become a center of my meaning to the study and devotion found in the left-hand path, particularly with traditional Satanism. And that's the short of the long, I suppose.
Yeah, I have a feeling there's more to it. So, when you mention Satanism and left-hand path in general, there's kind of a spectrum. I'm curious where you fall on that spectrum, because you have on one end maybe like the atheistic, almost libertarian Satanists, and then all the way on the other side of the spectrum, you've got almost the opposite, kind of the neo-pagan spiritual types. So where are you in that, on that scale?
Yeah, you actually, with that question, you highlight a kind of key consideration with the term the left-hand path. So the left-hand path is both useful and it's not terribly useful at all in another regard. So it's useful in the terms of as an umbrella to understand how people might identify. So if I say I'm left-hand path, then you might think, okay, they might be okay with something like traditional witchcraft or chaos magic. They might be influenced by Luciferianism or Satanism. They might work with the Kelipot, or how some say the Klipoth, the inverse tree of life. You might get an idea of the kind of magical paths that they're involved in. That's how it's useful. Where it is not useful, and where it's growing actually more cumbersome, especially as modern occultism develops, becomes more syncretic and so forth. And as different religions begin to, these heterodoxical religions begin to mature and evolve, in a sense of morality, right? So we can understand left-hand path so much as we understand right-hand path. Now, if we understand right-hand path, then we understand it to, at least traditionally, to be in alignment with or a supplication towards the divine, who is this kind of edified moral compass. We think of the Abrahamic religions. We think of Buddhism if we think of it in this very antiquated sense, this is right or wrong. This is a deontological. This is what is a list of moral attributions that you must align with. Then the left-hand path is an answer to that. It's an answer to that kind of, it's viewing morality as this kind of edified thing that you must, that you are asked to supplicate to, or to adopt. And the left-hand path is this adversarial rejection thereof. I believe that whole conception is somewhat antiquated. You see now the traditional, what we would call right-hand path religions like Wicca, moving into traditional witchcraft, older forms of witchcraft that, although one ointment they will kind of cook up to heal your child from sickness, in a second they would also stab a frog into a tree in order to curse a woman who's trying to move on your husband. So they didn't have this moral guideline, this strict moral guideline that we understand today. So you see Wiccans and other aspects that we used to call, in quotes, the right-hand path, moving towards a more crooked path, and a more, postmodern aspect of ethics, I suppose you could call it. So in that sense, as far as a moral alignment or a moral indictment, the left-hand path is becoming less and less useful. So where I fall into that, having said that, is I'm a Satanist, and I haven't veered from that. There's a lot who in the 90s, when they became familiar with Satanism, they became familiar with Anton LaVey. And so, like you had said, the libertarian, modern Satanism and all that, this atheistic. Mm-hmm. But Satanism has grown over the decades following. And I'm very much a believer in the sense that you see a breakup between atheistic and theistic Satanism, which I think is further a silly dichotomy. It's a silly way to identify a religion, but it is what it is. And I would consider myself more of a theistic or esoteric or traditional or orthodox Satanist.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you. And you're a performer as well. So how does this performance art that you do, how is it related to your theistic Satanism?
The performance art aspect came from my love to, one of my first artistic loves was towards poetry, towards spoken word poetry, written poetry, spoken word poetry. And I got involved in the slam poetry scene early on in LA. And in there, I started to inject some of the occultic or ritualistic aspects. So I turned slam poetry into this ritualistic thing. I had a small segment of the slam scene really loved it, but a larger part is quite rigid, actually. And a larger part was shocked by it. I enjoyed both probably equally. And that then led into later on being involved in different occult groups and traveling, and where there would be lectures and conventions. Then I started doing more ritual performance art that involved different forms of body modification, bloodletting, and devotional work in a public setting. So the performance art kind of envelops both of those spheres.
Okay. And is that, other than just being a performance and like a spectacle for shock value, is there a spiritual dimension to that for you personally, while performing?
Right. Well, I suppose it's provocative. I think shock is interested necessarily in a relationship to the audience's kind of boundaries. And I think there's importance to transgressing boundaries. But that's more accident in the work I do. It's simply in private, or if I am doing a public ritual, I do involve this forms of transgression. For me, I have always been plagued with a busy mind. That is to say, it's not simply that I am distracted by several things at once. It's that I have a barrage of thoughts and awareness that often gives rise to different forms of anxiety and things like that. And I found through transgression, physical transgression, I remember the first time I suspended, that is to say, I had hooks put into my legs and my back that allowed me to go into like a lotus position, is what they call it, from a tree. Actually, they're doing suspensions under a tree. And this is very mythological now that I
Mm-hmm.
kind of think about it, but it was one of the first times that I had a clear mind, or a still mind, as they would say in Buddhistic meditation, or Zen meditation. I was without thought, right? And it was that extreme physical transgression that allowed me to have an open mind and a still mind. So for some, having a glass of wine, for some, they don't need it. There's no implement at all. For some, it's a decorated ritual room, or it's a particular litany, chant, or yantra. For me, oftentimes, body modification, self-mutilation, this physical transgression helps clear my mind for a higher order.
So it's really by plunging into the somatic awareness, you transcend the rational discursive intellect and are able to enter into a sort of non-dual consciousness.
I think that's a beautiful way of putting it. I think what it does is it removes you, exactly what you said. It removes you from the dualistic physical spiritual realm, and it puts you in a space that I think, Janice, you might agree with. It puts you in a space to perhaps operate on this level necessary for occult practice.
Well, and the inheritance of post-Enlightenment Western culture is this obsession with rationalism and an identification with the analytical intellect as the source of the identity. And this becomes a problematic egoistic construct. So by plunging into the materiality of the body, we can enter into a state of liminality that enables us to step outside of that false identity. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think what's interesting that you point out is it is, and I kind of describe this as I call it viatheosis. So this is a way to ascend oneself through violence, and I also call it the vios, or the god of violence. And this is for an article that was published with Anathema through one of their Pillars anthologies. And I talk about, and it's an idea I use to kind of describe what we're discussing, and that is using forms of violence in order to connect with the divine. So I don't necessarily feel that it immerses you in materiality, but it's certainly invoking a channel within ourselves as material beings in order to create a tabula rasa, a clean slate.
Wouldn't you say, though, that Satanism is, in a way, a method of encountering the numinous through materiality, rather than escaping it through a sort of transcendental spirituality that seeks to escape materiality? There's a plunging into the depths of matter and finding the secret fire at the heart of it.
I think you raise a point about Satanism that I'm fascinated with, and you took it a step further than what I think most understand Satanism to be. So we understand Satanism via the lens of modern Satanism, via the lens of Anton LaVey and the Church of Satan. And in his writings, there is this egoistic kind of affirmation of the flesh, affirmation of the body, rejection of the spiritual, so on and so forth. A psychocentric kind of affirmation. Within that context, then the way I'm speaking about an externality or a transcendental may not necessarily, would be riding the edge, because I'm speaking about it with a spiritual underpinning. And so we're riding the edge there, although we're still in line. But certainly where the line is drawn is that I am talking about a affirmation of the spirit or affirmation of the transcendental, and that would defy this aspect of modern Satanism. But what we've seen happening is, so in one sense, you're right. In a sense, this would be misaligned with what we've come to understand as the more modern or rational Satanism. However, Satanism, as like many other religions, it has grown up, and it's done so rather quickly, where now you have forms of Gnostic Satanism, Gnostic Luciferianism, so that the spiritual aspect of the left-hand path is now exemplified and an option within these paths, so that you can be a Satanist that understands Satan symbolically as a balancing factor, or however you view Satan ontologically, but not necessarily obsessed with the physicality of the human spirit, that is open to even a spiritual transcendence at the expense of human frailty, human physical frailty, right?
So where does because there's a role for Satan as just kind of a generic or symbolic adversary, which I think you alluded to, kind of moving beyond that has its place. But as far as Satan in kind of your theistic paradigm, what place does that being, what role does it play? Or
right. So within theistic Satanism, you find a myriad, a syncretic kind of, for each on an individualized level. For myself, and I think if we want to talk historically, actually, we don't have to go to me necessarily, but Satan is a kind of, he's on the earth. Historically speaking, he is, you saw some of the first pacts with Satan were soldiers on the field who would write a pact in their armor saying, Satan, I pledge myself to you so long as you protect me. Or the poorest people would appeal to Satan. Those who were the most desperate appealed to Satan because he was on the earth. God was the God of the nobles. He was the God of the king and the prince and the royal family. Landowners. Satan understands me as the downtrodden. Satan was the God of the people. God, Yahweh, is the God of the ruling class. So, and this is why you saw Satan acquire this, especially in the 19th century, he was a symbol, he was a protector of the working class. He was a socialistic symbol, communistic symbol, often used as defending the people against the bourgeoisie. That's no mistake. We understand Satan to be of the physical pleasures of sins. We all sin. And those who are without money or land often had no reconciliation to this sin. So Satan would forgive me for my sins, and Satan would affirm that. So Satan, I do acknowledge Satan in this aspect, but my theological conception of Satan goes a bit beyond that. But that's definitely one important. And I see him as a balancing factor, almost like a pantheistic, that the flame, the black flame that is often invoked in the left-hand path, the black flame of consciousness that some conceive as being delivered by Set in the desert. It's black flame of consciousness, the life itself from prokaryotic into eukaryotic life, the great rebellion of inert matter into living consciousness. That is a rebellion. So as the Luciferian rebellion against the divine, so that adversarial energy that makes nature what it is, as a willing force, I also see as an aspect of Satan, as I kind of devote myself, at least metaphysically, that's part of the conception as well. So I guess, in a theistic sense, in a monotheistic sense, in a pantheistic or polytheistic or panentheistic sense, I conceive of Satan in all these expressions.
Okay, interesting. And yeah, what you were speaking about earlier reminded me very much of Kimbanda in Brazil, on how kind of the lower class people they kind of turn to that kind of energy, that kind of being.
It almost sounds, though, like what you're describing as a sort of post paradigm. You know what I mean? And so it makes me wonder if that mythological figure is that figure, and I'm not denying the reality of that being as a entity, but is that figure really useful to as a symbol to describe what you're articulating? I mean, isn't it a challenge? Isn't it more challenging in a way to embrace something that keeps you tied through its name to the Abrahamic paradigm if you're really trying to transcend it?
I think that's a great question, right? So you're certainly Satan is coming from the Hebraic, Abrahamic paradigm. You're right, but I think your question is actually at the core of the answer, and that is we are all, everyone on this call, I think I can say pretty with certainty, grew up with these paradigms defining us, with families, culture, media, everything around us was in the context of Judeo-Christian belief. So in that sense, and even LaVey discussed this, in that sense, and prior to him, in that sense, Satanism is a stigma. It's a shock. It shocks the system into a reaction so that you can clear the psyche. And this is not just LaVey, but prior to LaVey, you had some of the fin du siècle, the turn of the century, late 19th century and mid 19th century thinkers who understood the power of the symbolism of Prometheus and Lucifer and Cain and Satan as these things that would shock us to attention. So in that regard, Satanism and Satan carries a powerful catalytic kind of current. But to move beyond that, because the next question was then why exactly anchor once it's kind of shocked you in that way?
Mm-hmm.
And I think because Satan as a universal edifice carries a lot of power, because it can also you can use it to kind of view other mythologies through a lens that may not capture in a Western sense. So I believe Satan carries power in a Western ideology. Now, if I grew up in Samaria, or I grew up in, among the Vedic times, or I grew up in indigenous, Native American or West African, Satan may not carry that power at all. And
mm-hmm.
I think, Dominic, you highlighted that by saying, mentioning Kimanda. Kimanda actually, it took the Western culture and it incorporated that into some of the demonic images like Baphomet and things like that,
right,
from grimoire kind of belief. So I think, but that notwithstanding, I think being from the culturation that I've had and from where I am in this point of history, Satan is incredibly powerful, and it will always be powerful, and still to this day for me. So
Shea, I'm wondering, because I've experienced, and I'm sure others have as well, going down that left-hand path too far can sometimes yield results that are exactly what you're asking for, I guess is the way to put it, and not what you're necessarily expecting. And what I mean is there a balancing act you have to kind of participate in so that you don't become overwhelmed with a certain type of energy that kind of becomes a little bit too chaotic and a little bit too overbearing? I'm hoping that this is making sense, because I know that when you align with certain energies,
right,
your life kind of follows that energy. And how do you navigate that? And let me know if that doesn't
Right.
make sense.
No. I think there's several things here. So I touched on it when we talked about moral attribution
Yeah.
between left and right path. So your question is absolutely valid, right? But digging into that, we are making the assumption that left-hand path deals with powers, or if I was right-hand path, if I was a Wiccan in the 1970s, from what position would one have to be to ask, do you have to worry about the powers you're dealing with, right? And if we dig into that, then we would say, okay, it would have to be it would have to be probably a traditional normative, Christian or something like that, to say, what about the powers you deal with? Well, I deal with fairies and whatever, even though fairies are incredibly dark if we look at the history. But that, setting that aside, so we have to acknowledge that we think of the left-hand path as dealing with quote unquote heavy powers because of a culturation we've had and a perception that demons and things are heavy powers. So let's acknowledge that aspect so we have a contextual. So having said that, if we think of baneful magic, because I think that's where this is kind of hitting at, baneful magic like curses or something like that, something that deals with violence or something that deals with destruction, I think that actually makes up a very small part of the left-hand path, actually. I think, in fact, what would we call Kimbanda? What would we call Santeria? What would we call these different indigenous paths when they, on the regular, Vodou or what have you, on the regular, are cursing their neighbor, cursing their boss or whatever? We wouldn't necessarily, would we call it heavy powers? Would we call it dark? But so that all considering, I think that I am more on the conservative side, I guess, if I were to label it, when it comes to things like baneful magic, when it comes to things that I do think are vibrationally heavy. I think demons are complex. When we think of the left-hand path, we think of people that are openly dealing with demons, although the left-hand path really at the core of it deals with all things. But let's discuss the demon part of it. I think like goetic demons and things like that and I think other spirits can be particularly heavy and staggering to interact with. I think angels can too, but that's a different story. So I'm conservative in the sense that I shy away from certain magic that only under very particular situations would I engage in like baneful magic or something like that, because I believe destructive energy, deconstructing energy is like you say, is something heavy. And I feel like you have to come upon that with an increased responsibility and accountability. So generally speaking, though, I think someone within the left-hand path can totally live a life as a Wiccan from the 1970s could have, where they think of healing and they think of merging with the divine, and they think of Satan as a charitable being or entity. And that's one of my points about the left-hand path, and actually why the term itself isn't exactly useful. So that someone on the left-hand path can talk about the feminine or masculine divine, and they can talk about what Wiccans used to own decades ago, in that you can have a quote unquote white light religious identity within the left-hand path. So
I think we need to visit the point of the whole two things, right? Number one, left-hand path. This really comes from the Hindu Tantra, tantric traditions, and people who practice Tantra in those traditions often reject the Western assimilation of the term left-hand path, not west hand. Well, I guess it is the west-hand path, but they reject that because they say it's not fair and not representative of what they do or what they believe. So in the West, we have to kind of look at that, take left-hand path as being something that has become culturally distinct or that is culturally, sociologically, and religiously distinct from the Vamamarg, from the Eastern understanding of Tantra, which really goes back to the veneration of the feminine principle, the Shakti. And you know, there are parallels in the transgressive practices. However, there's clearly separate and distinct characteristics that really that don't merge according to people who practice, you know, Hindu Tantra.
Yeah. If we're to, right. So you raise an important point, and that is, as we understand left-hand path today colloquially, at least within the esoteric context, is not at all what it originally came from. So you're speaking about the Vedic source of it. But what it does point to is the idea of our kind of dualistic morality, which did not exist in the Vedic origins of the left-hand path. It has become something else. You know, you get Gershom Scholem, who is kind of the preeminent scholar of Jewish mysticism. He discussed the Eliphas Levi and Blavatsky and MacGregor Mathers and the Golden Dawn and everything that came in the late 19th century into the early 20th century as their appropriation, I guess we could call it, of the Kabbalistic mysticism, or the Zephirot, or the Tree of Life, as the great heresy. In this way, we can think of the left-hand path in the esoteric sense as the great heresy. It is a recapitulation. It is a new conceptualization of left-hand path to represent different Western esoteric memes in the sense of memetics as these spheres of meaning. So you're absolutely right. Now we can look to it to teach us about non-dualism, and we can look to it to understand what they meant in a moralistic way. But beyond that, you know, Satanism is not going to fuse to Vedic teachings seamlessly. This is going to require a negotiation. So, you know, if we discuss the origination of the left-hand path, that's one conversation. If we discuss what the left-hand path means today in a Western context, that's a different conversation.
But what we're getting into, I think, too, is important, because this goes back to the figurehead too, right? Because we're using, what I've been trying to do is also call attention to the language we use. As a son of Hermes, that's important to me. And in both cases, we're using assimilated terms from traditions that aren't necessarily being engaged in, although in some cases I understand they are being engaged heretically. And having followed the development of the left-hand path, you know, let's just say from the 70s through now, right? I have seen certain figures who used to identify probably more along those lines move into more traditional, actual left-hand path. Like, you know, they actually become involved in like Kashmir Shaivism or Shaktism, or, you know, so I have seen a trajectory. I've been reading the work of people who have been involved on the left side of things in Western esotericism. And what I often see is actually a development into those traditions. The other thing I want to mention that I think is kind of analogic, corollary, and dovetails with, and we've been kind of dancing towards this, I think, is the identification of Lucifer with the adversary. Personally, I don't see those figures as being the same being at all in any way.
Right. Yeah. The Satan and I agree with you. I don't view. I mean, Satan historically, mythologically, symbolically is completely different than Lucifer in the same way. They have a completely different etymology. They have a completely different history. Satan being going as far back as the Old Testament, originally being an obstructing angel, an angel that is obstructing. In Numbers, he is obstructing Balaam, and it is an angel that appears to stop his path through a donkey at first. Then he appears with a sword. So it is and then in Job, you see Satan becoming as Alan Watts would say, a district attorney. So a judger, an accuser.
But he's still on the payroll.
He's still on the payroll. Indeed. And he still answers to the boss man, right? In that sense.
Isn't the show rigged then?
Right. So in that biblical sense, over time, he then acquires, around the 2nd century or 3rd century, he acquires this. He is retrofitted that every evil act, every evil being in the Bible is Satan. And then there's a universality where he becomes the cosmic principle of evil. He becomes the ultimate evil. So that's Satan. Lucifer is the son of Aurora. Lucifer is the light bearer, is the Lucifera, so the bearer of light. Lucifer's the morning star, like Venus. Lucifer often, seen as enlightenment or intelligence or awareness. Definitely a different energy or a different symbolic meaning than Satan the accuser or Satan the adversary. So I agree with you there. However, we look at, Milton, and we look at Lucifer the rebel becoming Satan, then these start to get merged and these start to become a bit ambiguous. But I think there is importance in each of them, in all of them.
I mean, and it also depends too. Like there's these different lenses, right? There's the historical development of a modern figure of rebellion through the romantic. Really, the romantic tradition is the origin of this. Because Milton, Paradise Lost, huge aspect there.
Right.
Then there's so we've got the literary tradition. Then we've got a sort of philosophical tradition.
Sure.
And then we also have a mythological tradition. He becomes the cosmic sin eater, basically. He becomes a cosmic scapegoat, and then you can trade. But then that gets dicey if you go back to the Book of Enoch, because you have different figures among the Nephilim that sort of, that are more prominent in that early Hebrew narrative than essentially the angel of Mars. Because Samael is the angel of Mars. And so he's really just fulfilling the potency of the cosmic warrior who's under the employ of the Old Testament God.
Yeah, it's really interesting you mentioned that because, for the longest time, I understand Lucifer to be a mistranslation where the son of Nebuchadnezzar is seen as descending from heaven. So it's actually from the Septuagint into English. It's a mistranslation. It's actually not. It's referring to a person descending from the glory of God, not as Lucifer. And Paradise Lost helped give life to that. That's what I thought was the thing. Lucifer was actually not Satan and never was, until I dug into it more scholastically and discovered that, although some of the Book of Enoch is actually sourced throughout, it's hard to kind of nail it down. Some of it was written in the 19th century. The parts about Lucifer descending from heaven was actually written in the 2nd century BCE. So interestingly enough, what's fascinating is that was a truth that found itself through a mistranslation. So the mistranslation created this idea of Lucifer becoming Satan and rebelling against heaven, which was actually an idea that was around the Nag Hammadi text, if I'm not mistaken. So it's a fascinating kind of development.
I really hold I don't call him a saint. I don't consider him holy. I consider him a bastard. But I hold Jerome responsible for this.
That's
Jerome
right.
Jerome
That's right. That's right.
mistranslated a
Yes.
Hebrew narrative that used Babylonian mythological imagery as an allegory to describe the fall of the king, when in reality that imagery is discussing the cosmological process of Venus rising and setting and her two sons Shalim and Shachar. So, I mean, and Jerome is also the one, and leads into the next point I want to ask your opinion on. Jerome also is responsible for the slanderous, evil lie that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute, when in fact she was the Apostola Apostolorum, the apostle to the apostles, the most favorite of the apostles. Why? Because he was demonizing the woman, which goes back to Judaic tradition. Yet,
Sure.
so we see this conflation of the woman, of femininity, with the adversary, which results in the demonization of women throughout Western culture post that. And so I want to ask you about your opinion about the feminine in Satanism as well, because the feminine is so much a part of Eastern West left-hand path. I mean, that's the Shakti cult, right? So in Shaktism, the feminine is the face of God. And in Western religion, the feminine is excluded, is excised. In Judeo-Christianity and in Abrahamic religions like Islam and traditional Judaism, women are seen as, subservient chattel, essentially. Yet in the left-hand path, they're empowered. But there's this conflation with corruption through the collective shadow.
So I think that's what's fascinating. One of the things that are fascinating about the left-hand path, culturally speaking, is that it has given rise to a form of feminine empowerment, at least an embodied one, that has a spectrum of the feminine character, the Lilithian spectrum. So you could see figures like Lilith being rehabilitated in feminism. You can see that going back some time. But the left-hand path has given back the bloody, violent kind of it's okay for a woman to be angry, violent. It's to be brutal. So the left-hand path has embraced Lilith in this way and in a greater aspect. But Satanism, the left-hand path, witchcraft has been a stepping stone, or at least some sort of foundation for feminism, going back now about 150 years. So you raise a very important point that I think one aspect of left-hand path's influence on Western culture has been to embrace the more quote unquote undesirable aspects of the feminine divine through figures like Lilith.
And what about the idea? I know that in some left-hand path circles, even Jesus is seen as kind of a rebellious figure, more of a Luciferian figure, not an adversarial figure, but he's in this sort of, I know there's an element of Gnostic LHP stuff where the Old Testament God is seen as really just a big demon. And in that case, then Lucifer is Jesus is the Luciferian rebel that liberates human beings from the tyranny of that slaver.
Well, and the sin eater, the sin eater and the scapegoat as well.
Yep.
Yeah. There was when I was maybe 14 or 15, I was reading a copy of The Black Flame, which was a periodical released by the Church of Satan. And at the time, I was still starstruck, not Star Trekked, but I was starstruck by the material coming out of the COS. And this was the Anton LaVey memorial issue. And in it, Blanche Barton, who was the high priestess at the time, interviews, I don't know his name, but he was someone who did like, I guess, 1940s classic, maybe ragtag type jazz or something. He was like a neo. I don't know what kind. I never listened to the music, but in the interview, she's interviewing him, and the whole thing, you think he's satanic as fuck because he's talking about 40s and 50s aesthetics, and he's talking about a lot of things LaVey did about what he found attractive about those eras of American culture. And in the end, I think Blanche Barden asks him something like, "Are you a Satanist?" And he says, "I'm actually a Christian." He says, Jesus Christ was the Anton LaVey of his time. And I still remember that to this day, to see Jesus Christ, the punk rock aspect of Christ, and the Gnostic idea of the Christos, the Blessed One, being this Luciferian solar deity. I think all of us here have probably watched Zeitgeist within the last 10 years, and this idea of connecting, and a lot of the late 19th century occultists did well in this, and that connecting all these symbols. Blavatsky did this a lot to a paranoid degree, connecting all these mythological things together. And yes, from an ophitic sense, Christ is the outer God, is the Gnostic. The Gnostic God is the Luciferian figure, the snake on the cross. And in that way, he is a adversarial figure, oddly enough. It took balls to tell the Roman Empire that you're the one true God.
Yeah, absolutely. So switching gears a little bit, because I definitely want to get into this. I am fascinated by the topic of your book that you've written, and is it out now?
It's been in pre-order since the winter solstice, since December 21st, 2022.
Okay.
And it's going to be physically published within the next, it's supposed to be the first week of March.
Okay.
Is
perfect.
when it's going to be physically printed and sent out.
Okay. Well, good timing for us to have you on then. I really want to get into Nietzsche and how he fits into this, and kind of how you got into him and your thoughts on him, and just kind of this book in general, because it does sound extremely fascinating to me.
Yeah, thank you. When I first started studying Satanism, which was like anyone else in the 90s, it was through a copy of the Satanic Bible that I picked up at the mall. And Anton LaVey references Nietzsche quite a bit. And when you look at the resources available at the time, and the Church of Satan written by Blanche Barton, and the biography of LaVey, there's Nietzsche mentioned throughout all of it. And so I started picking up Nietzsche, and I was 13. And so I didn't really, I had trouble understanding it at the time, but let alone I still tried to read it. And so I discovered Satanism and Nietzsche around the same time, and kind of had a casual study of Nietzsche, what would follow for the next 20 years. And then when I decided to take philosophy as a academic discipline more seriously, and then I moved to Belgium to get my master's degree in that, I decided to make that passion the thesis was Friedrich Nietzsche and the Satanic Milieu. And, in Europe, they accepted that kind of thesis because they're a little more flexible. Religious studies in the United States would be a little bit harder to get that kind of thesis through. But I was able to find a few thesis supervisors who were interested. And my book came about as that kind of lifelong passion and an expansion of my thesis into a book. So that's where that came from. But for me, Nietzsche's influence on Satanism was always obvious, and on the left-hand path, and on the occult in general. But no one had written anything about it. No one had ever put it in one place. I've seen some, Stephen Flowers and his Lords of the Left-Hand Path kind of mentioned a little bit. And there were some academic articles written by Jesper Peterson and Ruben van Looy and some of the handful of people studying Satanism academically had made references to Nietzsche, passing references, but no one had ever put together something just focused on that connection.
Cool. He's a fascinating character. I mean, problematic and paradoxical in all sorts of ways. What are your thoughts on, I mean, he famously says God is dead, lamenting. I think a lot of people think that he's maybe cheering on that idea, but it's more of a lamentation, right? Where the West has lost its kind of moral foundation. Yet he is no friend of Christianity. And I don't know that he was sad to see Christianity go by the wayside necessarily in some other senses. So what are your thoughts on that, just in general, just to start us off?
Sure. I think so. You're right in to say that it was a kind of lamentation. It was also a warning. Look, Nietzsche was very much giving a warning for a time to come. And he wanted to also give a moratorium on what God had come to represent as the center of morality and the center of meaning in Western society. He identified what he called the will to truth. This is something that happened with Platonic thought, the idea of the forms and the idea of an idealized paradisical kind of reality. There is something higher than nature as it is. This is why he often combated it, or this is why he often drew a distinction with what he called the Dionysian. The Dionysian tragedy, the Greek tragedy, was an acceptance of life as it is. It took the struggles and the tragedy and it confronted it in a playful way, or at least a way that allowed us to deal with the profound sadness and desperation that exists in daily life. He understood the Greeks. The Greeks understood this. Now, what he saw in the kind of after Socrates and with the Neoplatonic conception is that there is something greater than this life that they're in. There is this ideal that we should strive for at the expense of nature. And there is this higher truth. We saw this will to truth, to seeking this truth, as one that would deconstruct the idea of God itself. This seeking of truth as a higher ideal, the will to truth, would then disassemble God and eventually usurp God, so that he would no longer represent this center of meaning. So when Zarathustra, from Thus Spake Zarathustra, when Zarathustra comes upon the people and says, Gott ist tot, God is dead, it is speaking to the audience, and they actually don't respond to him because they don't understand actually what he's telling them. Nietzsche says, I see this thing coming, and I do not believe the people are quite understanding what I'm telling them. It's not simply that this religious figure in your lives is lost. It's that the very foundation of your lives is in threat. And he saw a time coming when he feared that we would not be able to replace our training wheels. That is to say, what we had relied upon for ultimate meaning. And so a lot of his philosophy was to prepare us and gear us towards understanding this calamity and reconciling it.
Do you feel, I mean, I get the sense a little bit that he was running from nihilism in a way, but yet without that spiritual component, you almost end up full circle back at nihilism in a way. I mean, can things like entertainment and philosophy really bring true meaning? Maybe yes. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, he talked about that quite a bit. He actually called a lot of entertainment, and he discussed kind of flippant investment, and he talked about hedonism as the narcotization. This was narcoticizing ourselves with a displacement of meaning. And he saw that as a form of what he called passive nihilism. This is merely an appeal to things that pacify us and
Yeah.
do not give rise to seeking towards the actual source of things or the core of things or the core of ourselves, to not discover who we are or look into those aspects of things. So he identified what entertainment as actually a response to the death of God. One response would be a kind of distraction, or a way to move ourselves from the task at hand. Another way that we could respond is through an aggressive deconstruction of the world around us that he called a form of active nihilism, although the active nihilism becomes a bit ambiguous in his writings. But one aspect of active nihilism is to deconstruct the world as it is, but he discussed the dangers in that. Destroying the world around us is not going to, we have to find something to go past it. So that's why many philosophers later would write about an aspect of complete nihilism or perfect nihilism. And I discuss that in my book as well, as Satanism as an answer to it.
Interesting. Would you mind going a little bit deeper into that?
Yeah. So one of the ideas kind of Nietzsche hinted on, and some philosophers that followed, especially the existentialists like Sartre and Camus, and Foucault, discussed a kind of deconstruction of the world so that we can build something upon it. And I noticed within, if we're looking at something that's a little more stable and has a larger foundation philosophically, with Satanism, we can't go too far beyond LaVey. So just sticking to LaVey and sticking to modern Satanism and sticking to the philosophical Satanism of the 19th century, we see a deconstruction of the moral values as is, and done so in a playful way. So here's these symbols. LaVey famously said in I believe it's called Satanis, is the documentary from like 1971 or something. And he said, in part of that interview, he says, you cannot simply scrape the psyche clean. You have to see yourself as a sinner and embrace it. You cannot not be a sinner. You could be the best sinner on your block. And I cite that idea quite a bit in my book because Nietzsche, I think, would see that as a development of his idea in a positive way. Now, that's not to say he wouldn't see all of it. You can only conjecture so much about a dead man's thought, but I think that one aspect of it he would find constructive, and that is that instead of erasing everything that Christianity has done in the West and everything related to Christianity, we can use some of this in order to define new meaning. So we don't get rid of all of it. We try to understand our place in it, and we use it to redefine who we are and redefine the world and find new meaning within it. So the, active nihilism sought to its completion is a way for us to be rid of the authoritarian social norms that have been imposed upon us, and discovering new meaning by discovering the world in a new way. And so things about I also highlight things like the Black Mass, things like the Satanic Ritual Chamber. So in the Black Mass, again, you're not necessarily doing away. What you're doing is you're going through the trauma of Christian theocracy, and you're burning the Bible, you're using the wafer, and you have the naked woman on the altar. So you're going through this process of what LaVey called a psychodrama. So this kind of psychological. And what's interesting is that Nietzsche defined himself a bit in terms as being a psychologist. So I see a very important line of legacy between this thought. So something like the Black Mass or the ritual chamber where symbols are inverted in order to affirm life. What Nietzsche called a saying yes of life, an affirmation of life through the deconstruction of the world as it was. So I highlight those points in, those well-documented areas of Satanism, and I highlight those points to kind of what looked like what Nietzsche wanted to move towards, which wasn't a complete throwing away of Christianity or Western morality, but being able to find oneself in that deconstruction.
Awesome answer. Thanks. That was beautifully put. I was wondering if you could, you mentioned earlier, he had this kind of yin and yang thing going on with his Apollo and Dionysus sides. And I was wondering if, I find the Dionysus side interesting, at least on the surface, especially considering what Dionysus represents mythologically, and the fact that Nietzsche succumbed to I don't know what the actual diagnosis was, but a sort of madness pretty early on. And it just is ironic given this Dionysus kind of connection. Would you mind kind of going into what Dionysus meant to his thought and his work?
Right. So in The Birth of Tragedy, and I actually devote the first chapter of the book goes into I call it a comparative philosophical analysis of Satan and Dionysus, of the romantic Satan, so the 19th century Satan, and Dionysus of Nietzsche. On one level, Birth of Tragedy was merely mirroring some of Arthur Schopenhauer's work, will and representation, and Nietzsche was kind of painting it in a romantic way, using some of the Greek mythology surrounding Apollo and Dionysus. On another level, we can describe that duality as Apollo representing form and governance and law and order, and Dionysus representing kind of the wild expression of reality as it is. I say that quite a bit in my book, Reality as It Is. That is accepting an immersion into the chaos and uncertainty. The Apollonic asks for a kind of understanding of reality, perhaps a pinning down of it, establishing or a forethought. While Dionysus, in his epiphany, that is to say his appearance, there would be a clamor, a loudness, a chaos. A lot of the cult of Dionysus, their stories of the women killing their children and marching running wild into the wilderness, disavowing their families. And Nietzsche correctly identified this as a full, unadulterated embrace of the world that we live in. This very hard to accept embrace of tragedy that humans have to acknowledge. No matter how much we try to anchor ourselves, no matter how much we try to entertain ourselves or distract ourselves from the world as it is, the Dionysian reminds us of this painful tragedy of life and the sadness and desperation that comes from it. So I saw some similarities with Dionysus. Nietzsche, actually, towards the end of his mental condition, some believe it was syphilis, and new research is kind of showing that he might have had a tumor that had put pressure onto his brain, and that caused a lot of the issues he was having and the dementia and things. And either way, towards the end of his life, he would sign his books with Dionysus. He would sign his letters, sorry. He would sign a lot of his letters with Dionysus instead of his own name. Wow. What's interesting is Crowley would sign his name as, he would sign his name as the beast, right? Aiwass, or what have you. So, or Baphomet, he would put Baphomet. So it's very interesting, that legacy.
And Nietzsche never drank, right? Or he didn't think alcohol was a good thing at the same time, which is kind of funny.
Right. Like there is evidence that, that he engaged at brothels or what have you. But I think it's a cheap shot. I noticed this in other parts of our society, in Western society, where we take someone who's a difficult thinker or someone who is difficult to understand or challenges us, and we like to put shots on them to simplify their standing. So there's, he was, he had syphilis, so right. He must have fraternized with prostitutes. So that is a way to diminish him in a very flippant way. Yeah. And I like that research is coming out that's kind of showing that maybe it wasn't, but we don't need a reason. Even if he did get syphilis, that doesn't remove the discomfort that his ideas bring.
Yeah.
What this makes me think of is, we're talking about philosophy here, but it does dovetail back into the LaVeyan stuff, because there's like a difference between theistic and philosophical versions of this, you know what I mean? And I see the same sort of inversion of power by reclaiming, a spurned term. You see it in culture all over the place. We even see it we were talking about Kimbanda earlier. We see it in Kimbanda. We see it with people using the term pagan as an empowering term, seeing people use the term witch as an empowering term, when in reality, in traditional societies, witches are malefic, malignant people who are seeking to undermine the community. But, in Western culture, we see witch embraced. And in the same way, we can, I think, look at Nietzsche as taking, ideas of Apollo and Dionysos and treating them in this sort of philosophical sense. But I think it's fairly safe to say that Nietzsche wasn't a practitioner of any sort of pagan religion. And I think that even his conception, when he says God is dead, I think that on the one hand, he's referring to perhaps just the Abrahamic God, because he's speaking about other gods. And on the other hand, I think he's giving voice to the zeitgeist, giving voice to the activity of rationalism on the collective unconscious. And I think that if we look at it from a Jungian point of view, the God image then at that point was becoming subservient to the sort of Descartesian, I think, therefore I am, the sort of egoism that we were talking about at the beginning of the episode as being exactly the kind of thing that people who are pushing themselves to go beyond the boundaries of the mind through what you said is a sort of spiritualized violence, are trying to move beyond, you know what I mean? So I think there's an interesting set of transformations of meaning that are going on here that bring us to the point of the distinction between the theistic and the philosophical aspects of this.
Right. So there's a couple things.
Is that clear enough?
Yeah, no. I understand. Well, there's a couple points of interest in what you said. So the first is the theological aspect of Dionysus, or the Nietzschean terms Dionysus or God, or even when we talk about Satan. So certainly Nietzsche was not he wasn't a theist in the way. It's fair to say he wasn't a theist. Although, when he discusses things like the will to power and the Dionysian force, it does get a bit ambiguous. But I think Nietzsche, like many other in his canon, liked to kind of poke and be provocative, and he used a lot of things that he kind of wavered in how much he believed in them. Although, he talked about things like the eternal recurrence, and he talked about it in sometimes a very literal sense. So it becomes very difficult to kind of nail down ontologically what Nietzsche meant by these things. But what we can say is probably he wasn't a traditional believer in Dionysus or anything else. So that's one side of it. However, he might have saw it as being a powerful symbol. I mention it in my book, saying that although there's no evidence to say that Nietzsche believed in this in any ontological sense, that he spoke with it with a passion, a fervent passion that would outshine most believers today. So these concepts meant so much that discussing on whether, the literalness of what he was talking about is not as valuable, I think, to me, because it was the highest and of the most importance to him, these concepts. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is you mentioned him bucking against Christianity. He does discuss the Vedic, and he does discuss Islam, and he does discuss Buddhism. In fact, he celebrates Buddhism as being a rejection of that central theistic figure. He saw Buddhism as being a partial answer to Christianity and its reliance on a central figure for meaning. However, at the time, they only had so many translations for what they, in Buddhism, you had sunyata, or emptiness, or Zen Buddhism, which was an abandonment of the physical world, and co-occurring origination, and all those ideas that you find in Buddhism. Nietzsche interpreted all that at the time, and so did Schopenhauer, as emptiness, as nihilism. But as we come to find out, emptiness was a bit more complex than that. Yeah. There was an idea of things codependent or rising, and but he described that what we need is a European Buddhism, is what he called it. So we need a Buddhism that rejects this central authority, this deontological authority, and which gives us the ability to also understand the world as not being permanent. So he appreciated Buddhism as presenting a philosophy that the world is transient, as embracing that transience, but he didn't care for the pacifism that you found in Buddhism. He saw that as nihilistic. So he saw active nihilism as possibly in a religious way, expressing itself as a European form of Buddhism. That is to say, a Buddhism that deconstructs a central figure, sees the world as transient, but affirms it in an active way.
Did he see the pacifism of Buddhism in a similar way that he saw that in Christianity, where they were more of like a slave mentality?
He did, actually. So he said the greatest nihilistic religions is Christianity and Buddhism. These are the great nihilistic faiths. But he saw Buddhism as having an opportunity to move beyond it. But that pacifism, that unwillingness, that kind of stoic response to a changing world, he saw Buddhism as inactive and therefore ineffectual.
Interesting. Quickly back to Dionysus for a second. I wanted to ask you and I forgot. Do you make the connection between Dionysus and like Rex Mundi or Satan?
Yeah. So some of the points that come out to me about Dionysus is that at some point he has seen, well, Nietzsche ties Dionysus to Prometheus as being these figures that force us to deal with the ugliness of life and react to it. And he, in that way, Satan kind of illuminates us to the ugly aspects of life, our sinful natures. this kind of adversarial confrontation with the world as it is. And even in my writing, I look for this that kind of unites the two. There was some academic work that's been done that shows that Dionysus was really Nietzsche using a satanic image. So all the reasons that the mid-19th century or the 19th century poets and writers had used Satan as a kind of symbolic figure or a allegorical figure, Nietzsche had used Dionysus for these same reasons. He'd even said in his updated preface for Birth of Tragedy, where does the billy goat in the satyr point? What he was saying is, where does the horned aspect of the goat in God can be found? So he was hinting that this can be found in Satan. So Nietzsche saw Dionysus as a way to confront the satanic aspect of life, that what we would understand is, at least within a satanic context, the satanic aspect of life as it is, accepting the cruelty of nature, accepting the cruelty of God.
Fascinating. Awesome.
I think Jung's comments are really interesting. He discusses how Jung says that in contradistinction to the Semitic God, or Semitic, I don't know, call him a god, angel, whatever, there's also another sort of devil figure that is more of a pre-Christian European pagan figure that is a devil, but he is not the Abrahamic adversary. And I've always found that point that Jung makes to be very interesting, because he's pretty emphatic about that figure not being conflated with the figure of the Abrahamic adversary. And I believe Jung then associates that figure with Odin, among other beings, and also Mercurius. So what Jung is doing, I think, is essentially drawing attention to the sort of trickster psychopomp figure in pre-Christian European culture. And that, to me, is interesting, because if we look at the Abrahamic impact on indigenous cultures around the world, in Africa, and among indigenous Europeans, we see the trickster figure demonized and relegated to the realm of the shadow, when in reality it's a traditionally consistent archetypal principle in indigenous cultures worldwide. But there's no trickster figure in Abrahamic religion, so that ends up being conflated with the archetypal shadow.
Yeah, no, that's a very important point, that it's fine. One might argue that this is a necessary aspect. I was actually just before I got on this with you guys, I was watching part of Northman. I'd already seen it before. I saw it when it came out. But in Northman, there's one of the opening scenes there's the jester there, and he's telling the king that your wife has eyes for other men. And it's this really offensive kind of thing to say to someone of royalty. But what's interesting is they tolerate the presence of the jester. He's allowed to completely disrespect, completely shit on the royalty in the room. And I started to think about, I don't know how historically accurate that is. I don't know if there was a jester in the Nordic pagan times in the pre-10th century. But I thought that might be important for a representative of the people to be able to criticize the royalty in their face in the most offensive ways, and what role that plays. It's an extension. The jester is the extension of the human spirit who wants to poke holes in the divine, because if I may, give a conjecture, I think we deal with an uncertain world, and the jester helps us through humor to make fun of the things that are edified. And if you look at it from a divine aspect, we need to be able to make fun of God. And the jester helps make fun of this eternal order that's so scary. That's why in chaos magic, in some aspects of chaos magic, you end a ritual with laughter. It's the ultimate weapon that a human has in order to deal with this powerful world that we don't really have. We don't have full control over the next, as magicians, we affect change in our ways, but there are certain things that are immutable in the world that we exist within. And to be able to laugh at it, to be able to make fun of it, is a type of power. So from what you said, it reminds me of that. The jester is this divine ability to make fun of this cosmic order of which we are somewhat have to confront at some point.
And do you think like laughter and humor have a place in the left-hand path? Because, a lot of people in the left-hand path, they come off as like super, super serious.
No, that's a good point. That's a good point. There was, I think one thing that's been lost, honestly, is LaVey was a funny guy, and he made fun of a lot of the things. And a lot of people actually criticize LaVey for that, wearing the horns and presenting himself as a devil. And they say, how do you take this guy fucking serious? But what you highlight is a very important point, that humor, as the left-hand path in Satanism has grown, we've lost some of that LaVeyan spark, that making fun of things. And I take that as a valid criticism, actually. So I think we need to reintroduce, in a general aspect, as things become more religious, we need to be able to laugh at things a bit more. And I think the core Satanists, and not just LaVey, but Stanislav Shibashevsky, they knew how to kind of make fun of things.
With you, though, we're talking about essentially a philosophical book here, but with you, where do you fall in the spectrum? Like, do you consider yourself theistic? Do you consider yourself philosophical? Do you follow a particular tradition? Because, there's so many. There's the Sitra Achra.
Sitra Achra, yeah.
There's the Draconian tradition of Carlson. There's
Sure.
the Temple of Set. I don't even consider the most popular group at the current time. I don't even think they qualify, because they're really just a political action group founded by a person who really is I think, a covert process church. I wouldn't say member, because the process church doesn't really exist anymore, but it's really just a process.
I wish he was that interesting. I know you're talking about Lucien Greaves, but I wish it was that. I have nothing against Lucien Greaves. I think he believes in the kind of the movement he started, and that's great. And I think, the Satanic Temple itself, I don't find particularly interesting. Lucien Greaves, I see him trying to hearken to the 19th century kind of some of the satanic poets, and take some of those ideas, but I think that's lost in the general movement. I think it's a reactionary political movement, but that's fine. I consider them the cousins I don't want to see at Christmas dinner. I don't want to run into them, but I consider them my satanic cousins. As far as where I lie, I say a bit of Temple of Set, so a bit of Aquino. No esoteric Satanist can really give grounding to their belief without at least hearkening to Michael Aquino and the work he's done with the Temple of Set. So I have to immediately do that. Kenneth Grant, as much as people are trying to move towards Kenneth Grant in contemporary occultism, did not actually have a major influence on the left-hand path at the time. We just have to acknowledge that for what it is. Kenneth Grant did have influence now, and he's having influence presently, but he did not have influence on any. If it wasn't for LaVey, this is the thing that's hard for people to come to terms with, but just they kind of have to objectively. And that is, without LaVey, we wouldn't have Satanism. Like, we wouldn't be discussing the left-hand path in the Western world or anything like that. Now, there could have been another reason that it happened, but in our world, in this timeline, in this dimension, Anton LaVey is the reason we're having this conversation. And that's fine. We don't have to agree with anything LaVey said, but it's what brought it into the zeitgeist. And Kenneth Grant kind of came later. But could you say the other part of what you said? Because I think there was another point I wanted to respond to.
Well, I mostly wanted to know where you stand among the spectrum of those perspectives. And I would say, I don't know. I think that the point you just made, though, begs reconsideration, because I remember seeing the flowering of a synthetic egregore that was a sort of composite form of the chaos magic movement, which really, though it's, chaos magicians in the 80s and 90s said that they didn't really believe anything. What they really did in practice was a combination of Satanism, trying to get the gods of Lovecraft to really
totally,
and a little bit of Teutonic mysticism, Temple of Set, and Typhonian OTO, and a lot of those people were in both the Temple of Set and Typhonian OTO. So there was a sort of ceremonial Satanism that arose within the 80s and 90s that was like really the child of, I would say, Temple of Set and the Typhonian OTO.
Sure. But I think Aquino's movement in this terms of esoteric left-hand path was very much married to the Church of Satan and LaVey movement. Aquino was really believed in Anton LaVey, really believed in his movement. And they were both actually crushed by his departure in 1974, 1975, when the Temple of Set diverged. Aquino didn't want to do that, and LaVey didn't want either. But it was something that kind of set the pace for what would come. Now, back onto but what the chaos magic, the one point on that is chaos magic does point to a very interesting development in esotericism. I see chaos magic as a denunciation of tradition, a deconstruction of tradition, and saying we're just going to use what works. In that sense, this deconstructive kind of active nihilistic way that chaos magic developed itself is a very fascinating movement in Western esotericism. And you're right in saying that it's left-hand path. I think it totally is. Where I kind of find myself is I look to the Luciferianism of Blavatsky. I look to the early literary Satanists and some of the traditional diabolatry. Satan as this figure you appeal to for worldly affair. But I look to the Levi or Levian aspect of Satan as this balancing figure, as this cosmic force, the Sophitic Gnostic aspect. But if I had to choose someone, if I had to choose one group that I mostly align with, it's all these aspects that I kind of incorporate into my own practice. I think Johannes Nephastos and his Star of Azazel, so his work in the Phosphoros and Catechism of Lucifer and Agat Azim and a lot of the work he's done on Gnostic Satanism, I think has influenced me quite a bit, but it's more he's galvanized what was already there, and that is an adoration of theosophic mysticism. So Blavatsky mysticism and how it relates to Lucifer and Satan.
Do you consider that figure to be an objective entity?
I do.
Okay.
Yeah, I do. I'm I think there's far more to it. We can discuss the symbolic meaning and we can discuss the metaphysical meaning, but in a very real way, in summary, yes, I'm a believer.
And I think that's significant, right? Because the way we engage with something we see as being alive and real is different from something we just see as like a construct.
Yeah, no, I pray every day. and I ritualize, and I believe in the gods I pray to. I think in our modern times, and I think this is highlighted a lot in Nefastos' work, but how, as occultists, we are fighting for this relationship to belief. And understandably, in our modern times, that is just inundated with rationale, scientific reductionism. It becomes difficult to believe. And I think we're looking for evidence of our belief. A lot of occultism says, look for the results of your magic. And it almost becomes this midnight or 2 a.m. infomercial about magic's effectiveness. And I think magic, it is important for magic to work for you and all these things, of course, and for you to, find success in your religious belief. But there is this constant battle between belief and faith and occultism and trying to reconcile it in our modern times. I actually see it as a beautiful struggle, but I see it as one that's difficult. So I pray and I believe, and I also doubt constantly. And this is a struggle that I go through, that I say in earnest and honesty, that being a person of faith in our modern world, if you're going to be honest with yourself, is actually quite a struggle. And it's quite although I've had experiences within this whole thing that are, some would say, is completely unquestionable. I try to be a skeptic. So I'm a faithful skeptic, and that I question everything I see and everything I experience. I'm anti-woo-woo. I don't like the silliness of just UPG, unverified personal gnosis. I don't like Facebook occultism. So I try to fight for something more serious, to be more skeptical. And in that, I'm in a constant tug of war. I've had very compelling experiences that I'll die with. But, I acknowledge that we live in a skeptical time, and that's a struggle that we deal with as occultists.
So you believe in magic for sure then?
100%.
Well, that's good, because we do too.
Yeah. No, I believe in interacting with spirits and magic, and it causing change in the world that we exist in. And I think it's had pretty fantastical changes in my life that I'm very deeply grateful for. And so to deny it, one of the satanic rules that Nietzsche puts down, he has these 11 satanic rules, and one says, it's actually the last one. Do not deny the power of magic after you've utilized it for your benefit.
That's
and
awesome,
I think
actually interesting. Yeah.
And I think there's power in that, don't.
Absolutely.
There's the axiomatic, the 4 laws: to know, to will, to dare, and to keep silent. So to keep silent, but LeVay kind of adds in that extra part that is, do not deny that which you've already spoken. Right. So we must keep silent, but also do not deny what you've already said. So, yeah, great.
Thank you. That was a very interesting, thought-provoking discussion.
Yeah, no, I thought that was awesome.
And I think both of you have facilitated some, I guess, what I consider some of the most thought-provoking questions. It actually had me kind of thinking about things quite a bit.
Okay, awesome. And what else do you have going on that people can kind of follow up with or tune into?
Yeah, so Friedrich Nietzsche and the Left-Hand Path is from Atramentis Press. That's going to be published in the first or second week of March. So if you're interested in that, you can find it there. I have another project I'm working on with Samuel David, who is a kind of, his expertise is in the Mesopotamian mysteries. So we're looking at co-authoring a book project that kind of ties the line between Mesopotamian belief and Left-Hand Path, which has often been loosely and haphazardly connected. So we want to kind of cut to the core of it. So that's a project that we're going to be working on for the rest of the year. I also have my own podcast. I'm on a podcast. I know it's okay to promote my own,
totally.
which is a Deferred Gnosis podcast. And
please do. Yeah.
Plug
yourself.
Yeah. So there's also a documentary series on the occult that's supposed to be coming out on Apple TV that I did over a year ago, and now it's finally going to come to fruition. So that should be later in the year, around fall.
Awesome.
So yeah,
that's super great, dude.
Thanks, Janice, Dominic. Thank you so much.
All right, so that was Shea Bile, an erudite and eloquent exponent of the metaphysics of Nietzsche. What a cool conversation. You know, it's our aim on this podcast to explore a spectrum of perspectives and expose people to a variety of ideas and aspects of metaphysics, inclusive of the metaphysics of magic, but also genuine philosophy, theology, etc. We, as sons of Hermes, cleave to a certain impartiality and an openness, and I'm so glad that we remain true to that ideal with this conversation. It was so interesting, and I hope that everyone listening got something out of it too.
Yeah, I think this was I wouldn't say a surprise, but it was an eye-opening episode. Shea is very convincing. He's a great advocate for his perspective and that particular path. He makes a strong case for it, and articulates that viewpoint very well. So yeah, I mean, I'm definitely intrigued by this book that he has coming out on Nietzsche. That sounds super interesting, actually. And yeah, it was just really fun and eye-opening and interesting to talk to yet another really intelligent, well-read practitioner.
And I think one of the things to keep in mind here is that just as in every other area of life, we need to be conscious of not allowing ourselves to fall into assumptions about others. Just as sometimes people leaning towards the right-hand path can unfortunately be maligned as boring or idealistic or over-traditional, which none of those things are the case with many of them. People on the left-hand path in the Western esotericism, I don't really mean the Vamamarg or the Eastern traditions of Tantra, but in the West, the left-hand path can also have its own cliches of dark spookies who are obsessed with cliched devil figures and things like that, and it becomes equally tedious. And then you encounter people who are actually living in this and take it seriously and are involved and devoted. I'll take somebody who is practicing anything in a serious, diligent, and sincere way over somebody who is just a theoretician any day of the week.
Yeah. And it's just also very interesting what he practices. I mean, it's kind of like a modern Western tantra in a way. And it's not that different from things like Gnosticism in that, in the way that Gnosticism kind of turns things upside down to kind of give you a new perspective, thinking outside the box and that kind of stuff with, the snake in the garden is not necessarily the bad guy and things like that. It's interesting to kind of experience these thought expanding paradigms and it's definitely worth keeping an open mind towards. Okay, so as far as our book review, what do you have for us this week?
I have an intriguing, wonderful biography published by Neptune Press, written by Julia Phillips, on Madeleine Montalban, the Magus of St. Giles. Madeleine is a personal hero for me, heroine, I should say. She is a marginalized figure in the history of modern Western esotericism. And it's kind of a shame because she was brilliant, charismatic, enthusiastic, innovative magician. She was an English woman. And she ran an order called the Order of the Morning Star, which exists to this day. And she taught a system of sacred magic, of angelic magic, based upon the Pauline art. She was also a tarot reader and an astrologer, and was sort of in the scene, the sort of, popping off, thriving, magical scene of her day. And this is a wonderful biography of her that talks all about her and her life and the people she was associated with and ideas that she taught in her order. It has many full color images of all kinds of things, images that she used in her order, pictures of her with different individuals, including her magical lodge, history. I mean, she's such to me, she's such an interesting figure. She was, a very powerful, intelligent woman who ran a magical order in England and was actually fairly well known at the time in magical circles. She did not do Golden Dawn style magic. She created a system all her own, which she taught was inspired by the archangels and the planetary angels, the teaching angels. She also, interestingly, it appears that Alex Sanders, who founded quote unquote Alexandrian witchcraft, that he was strongly, heavily, you could say, influenced from her, that he used some of her material in his own witch cult that he formed, his Wiccan cult. So she had a far-ranging influence to the present day. This book is just really neat. It's so cool. I love learning about her. She was so interesting. And these days, there's always a flavor of the week when it comes to magic. And there's perennially popular figures in magical history, especially in modern magical history. You always hear people talking about Crowley or Gardner or, even Dion Fortune or Yeats or any number of other figures. But there's people that, for some reason, yes, they're known to a certain degree, like Paschal Beverly Randolph or Madeleine Montalban, but they're relegated to the sidelines because, for whatever reason, they just don't have the popular interest. And it's a shame because you can learn a lot from them. I've learned a lot from this book, and I've also learned a lot from Madeleine's other work, which I highly recommend. And I also just recommend it because I honor her legacy and I wish her well where she is.
Very cool. And the name of the book again?
Madeleine Montalban, The Magus of St. Giles, by Julia Phillips. It came out on Neptune Press.
Nice. And I believe she had a significant influence on a former guest of our show, Balthazar, of Balthazar's Conjure, which I think we talked about Madeleine a little bit in that interview. So it might be worth going. Might be worth going back to listen to that one.
And interestingly, I think that people who are interested in traditional witchcraft would recognize the name of Michael Howard. And Michael Howard was heavily influenced by Madeleine and learned a lot of what she taught. And he also integrated that in his teachings. Speaking of Balthazar has a very exciting new project coming out. It's a deck of cards, The Divine Gypsy Mother. It's going to be coming out on Scarlet imprint. We're not being paid to advertise this. We just love his work.
It'd be nice if we were paid for it. That'd be cool.
So give us lots of money. But just kidding. But we're excited about this. And he's also been doing some interesting angelic work. So go check his stuff out and support him.
Absolutely. Okay. I think it's time to wrap up. So on that note, thank you everyone for listening. As always, we appreciate your support, listenership, the positive feedback. Keep it coming. And yeah, we're reaching people all over the world, which is fascinating. So hello to our listeners in Hong Kong, Australia, England, New Zealand. Thank you all for listening.